In Chapter 40 of Patrick Rothfuss's popular fantasy novel, The Name of the Wind, the main character, Kvothe, is narrating the early years of his time at an arcanist school. On his way to meet with the 9 elders of the school who will determine his punishment for hurting a teacher, he meets someone who will take him to them. I was met by Jameson. He oversaw everything that wasn't under direct control of the masters: the kitchen, the laundry, the stables, the stockroom. He was nervous and bird-like. A man with the body of a sparrow and the eyes of a hawk. That's an interesting way to describe someone, isn't it? The Name of the Wind came out in 2007, but magic schools had been popular in fantasy fiction for almost a century before then. Of course, the first instance of a magic school is not really knowable. The earliest I could find was around the end of the Middle Ages, but it is almost certainly not the first. Legends very rarely have traceable beginnings. Harry Potter in 1997 is probably the most popular example of magic school today, but I don't think Rothfuss is referencing Harry Potter in his school. The island of Gaunt, a single mountain that lifts its peak a mile above the storm-racked Northeast Sea, is a land famous for wizards. From the towns in its high valleys and the ports on its dark, narrow bays, many a Gauntishman has gone forth to serve the lords of the archipelago in their cities as wizard or mage, or, looking for adventure, to wander working magic from isle to isle of all Earthsea. Of these, some say the greatest, and surely the greatest voyager, was the man called Sparrowhawk, who in his day became both Dragonlord and Archmage. His life is told of in the Deed of Ged and in many songs, but this is a tale of the time before his fame, before the songs were made. The first time I heard those lines, I was too young to remember them. My parents read to me and my brother from a very young age, and for a while we only read fantasy. We swept the whole gamut from Lord of the Rings to the Chronicles of Narnia to Earthsea. Those bedrocks of fantastic books laid the groundwork for my love of literature today, and it's thanks to fantasy that my library, my published work, and this YouTube channel exist. As an adult, I have reread almost all of these series, and one of them rises above them all. The Earthsea trilogy follows Ged. But on the Earthsea archipelago, people don't go by their true names. True names hold power, and if one is given the true name of another, they can hold that power over them. These names are not something you are born with. Instead, they must be given by a mage or witch at a certain age, and after that, you should only give your true name to people you trust. True names are difficult to remember, slippery. Some things, primordial things, have names that are lost to all but the dragons. And here lies the kind of chaotic beauty of Ursula K. Le Guin's magic. In the Earthsea trilogy, the magic that the magicians wield is hard to nail down. "You want to work spells," Ogion said presently, striding along. "You've drawn too much water from that well. Wait. Manhood is patience. Mastery is 9 times patience. What is that herb by the path?" "Starflower." "And that?" "I don't know." "Forefoil, they call it." Ogion had halted, the copper-shod foot of his staff near the little weed, so Ged looked closely at the plant, and plucked a dry seed pod from it, and finally asked, since Ogion said nothing more, "What is its use, master?" "None I know of." Ged kept the seed pod a while as they went on, then tossed it away. "When you know the forefoil, in all its seasons, root and leaf and flower, by sight and scent and seed, then you may learn its true name, knowing its being, which is more than its use. What, after all, is the use of you, or of myself? Is Gaunt Mountain useful, or the open sea?" Ogion went on a half-mile or so, and said at last, "To hear, one must be silent." The wizard that gave Ged his true name, Ogion the Silent, is a reclusive but kind man. He sees potential in a young Ged, and decides to take him as an apprentice after his naming ceremony. But studying magic is not as exciting as Ged imagined. Frustration starts to build up. But Ogion the Silent is a careful teacher, and the magic of Le Guin's mages starts to work on us as well. Still, no marvels and enchantments occurred. All winter there was nothing but the heavy pages of the runebook turning, and the rain and the snow falling, and Ogion would come in from roaming the icy forests or from looking after his goats, and stamp the snow off his boots, and sit down in silence by the fire. And the mage's long, listening silence would fill the room, and fill Ged's mind, until sometimes it seemed he had forgotten what words sounded like. And when Ogion spoke at last, it was as if he had, just then and for the first time, invented speech. Yet the words he spoke were no great matters, but had to do only with simple things, bread and water and weather and sleep. But all is not well. Ambition still boils a little inside Ged, and during his studies, Ged reads a name in a book he wasn't supposed to read. As he read it, puzzling out the runes and symbols one by one, a horror came over him. His eyes were fixed, and he could not lift them till he had finished reading all the spell. Then, raising his head, he saw it was dark in the house. He had been reading without any light, in the darkness. He could not now make out the runes when he looked down at the book, yet the horror grew in him, seemed to hold him bound in his chair. He was cold. Looking over his shoulder, he saw that something was crouching beside the closed door, a shapeless clot of shadow darker than the darkness. It seemed to reach out towards him, and to whisper, and to call to him in a whisper. But he could not understand the words. The door was flung open wide. A man entered with a white light flaming about him, a great bright figure who spoke aloud, fiercely and suddenly. The darkness and the whispering ceased, and were dispelled. Ogion banishes the shadow, but this light only buys time. What Ged read was something unknown, something dark and profane and impossible, and now the only way to be rid of the shadow is to learn its true name, learn the name of something no one understands. This monumental task will lead Ged on a long journey. He travels to the mage school on the island of Roke, a foundational academy ruled by the 9 masters. He travels to slay dragons, to ask old mages their advice, to visit mysterious women in castles, and at the end confronts the thing that haunts him past death, past the great interstice between the living and the dead that he sees as a long wall of stones. I'll leave that conclusion for you to find, if you haven't already done so. All of these stories, including the wealth of others from the next 2 books, The Tombs of Atuan in 1970 and The Farthest Shore in 1972, allow us to follow Ged through his long life, and from there we lay in awe of Le Guin's stunningly beautiful prose. For Le Guin, prose is often a rhythmic thing. The way words sound, the way they emerge from human minds together, is as important as the clarity or simplicity of text. We could fill hours of time simply talking about how innovative Le Guin's view of fantasy was. But for now, let's stick to the stories, because I've been lying to you. Earthsea is not a trilogy. Le Guin wrote the first 3 books very quickly, from 1968 to 1972. And then Le Guin had a kind of turning point in her writing. This trilogy that she had spun, a boy arising from nothing to conquer dragons and become Archmage, was something she was proud of, but there was also something wrong with it. It wasn't the story she really wanted to tell. In a letter to her agent, Virginia Kidd, Le Guin implied she was having a kind of literary crisis, that up until that point, she had been writing as a man in a man's world. There is no doubt that I have to find out how to write all over again, because I am in a different country where the language is different. I don't speak this language yet. It really is maddening, Virginia, because I know how to write the old language now. I really have learned my trade, and to have to abandon all that and start all over. But there is no option. And she was right. Fantasy, especially in the 70s, was a man's game. Science fiction even more so, and Ursula had started to play by the genre's rules. She wrote Ged, a man who comes from nothing to become Archmage. Roke, the learned school of magic, is headed by 9 men. Women are not even allowed on school grounds. Tanar, who was the female point of view character for Tombs of Atuan, was rescued from her secretive religion by Ged. The Farthest Shore, the next and third book in the trilogy, follows Ged and Arryn, who would become king of Earthsea, to the ends of the world. Two men on an adventure to greatness. And one of the most interesting things about wizards in her fiction was their celibacy. The wise men of Roke Island never slept with women. Why would Le Guin write like this? That is an incredibly complicated question, one wrapped in almost 100 years of literary culture, fantastical zeitgeist, and millennia of repression. But to uncomplicate it for the sake of the video, it's because that was how fantasy was written back then. C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, even later editions that Le Guin praised, like Gene Wolfe, they were the ones that shaped what fantasy was. And writing with giants like them, well, let's just say it would be difficult to find books that went against the grain, let alone publish one of your own. But Ursula grew. She had 3 children, becoming a mother, and learning to write as a woman. And with this realization, with this immensely difficult literary growth, came floods of new theories, of ways to tell her stories that couldn't be told under the model she had written the trilogy under. In her landmark 1986 essay, The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, she wrote about a new theory of storytelling, setting it up as a kind of antithesis to Joseph Campbell's famous hero's journey theory, which was released to great fame in The Hero with a Thousand Faces in 1949. But she didn't stop at theory, and she also didn't leave fantasy. In 1990, 18 years after her last inclusion to the fantasy genre, Tehanu, the last book of Earthsea, came out, and it was very different. Ged reappears after saving the world by traveling to its end, and this time, he comes home, back to Gaunt, to where it all began. There, Tanar, the girl he rescued from the Tombs of Atuan, lives, but she isn't a girl anymore. She's an old woman, and Ged is not Archmage either. He is withered, powerless, and also old. Here, for the first time, we see Le Guin's style evolve into her new form, a form still regarding the role of the men she had imbued her story with, but now also including a focus on the women. It is readily apparent from her conversation with Virginia Kidd that Le Guin had struggled with her identity as a female writer in the late 70s and 80s. Julie Phillips, Le Guin's self-requested biographer, has stated that Le Guin felt a rift growing between her writing and that of the popular men around her, but also a rift with the second-wave feminist movement of her time. In a conversation with DavidNaimon on the Crafting with Ursula section of his Between the Covers podcast, she states, "Almost all of the women I wrote about, and particularly the ones with an academic education, felt that they had always been told that, you know, you can have babies or you can have books, but you can't have both." This is an exploration of what Phillips calls the mind-baby problem in her book, The Baby on the Fire Escape. How can women, when motherhood is seen as an all-consuming identity, also be writers, also be artists? Le Guin became a mother in 1957, and she found herself stuck in between the two extremes of the chauvinist system of her university and publishing industry and the anti-mother sentiment of the second-wave feminism. The publishers of science fiction, the universities, wanted rich men to write literary theory and study fine arts. If they absolutely had to, they might settle for unpregnant, unmarried women. But feminists didn't want mothers as writers either. Much of the movement in the early 70s was focused on rebelling against stereotypical traps. The movement was made of women, but it was also mostly made of daughters. Le Guin, though, had a loving partner in her husband, Charles, and she loved being a mother. But she also was a famous writer, and she still felt she had more to tell. As Phillips says in her Between the Covers interview, "That's very true that she was very defensive of being a housewife and a mother in a genre of science fiction where there aren't that many parents, and at a time when a lot of feminism was daughters rebelling against their mothers and against motherhood. She said that motherhood was presented as the paradigm of brainless enslavement, and that wasn't her experience. Her experience was challenging and empowering, and took everything that she had and was really rewarding in return intellectually and emotionally, and so she was not seeing herself reflected in feminism. Phillips is talking about this gap between 1975 and 1990, the gap between The Farthest Shore and the fourth book of Earthsea, Tehanu, a story about Tanar, an old woman taking care of a damaged girl with an old man. Why are men afraid of women? If your strength is only the other's weakness, you live in fear, Ged said. Yes, but women seem to fear their own strength, to be afraid of themselves. Are they ever taught to trust themselves? Ged asked, and as he spoke, Theru came in on her work again. His eyes and Tanar's met. No, she said, trust is not what we're taught. She watched the child stack the wood in the box. If power were trust, she said, I like that word. If it weren't all these arrangements, one above the other, kings and masters and mages and owners, it all seems so unnecessary. Real power, real freedom would lie in trust, not force. As children trust their parents, he said. Theru, the girl in that passage, is a hurt child. When she was young, the band of beggars she was born into raped, beat, and burnt her. Only Tanar chose to take care of her. As Theru grows older, she still retains the scars of the injustice done to her. Half her body is scarred and mangled by the fire. Her hand is frozen perpetually into a claw. She barely gasps out sounds. But motherhood takes time. Moss is another character we meet in Tehanu. She is an old witch who also lives on Gond, and a powerful feminism flows from her too. Tehanu as a text is laden with these gendered conversations, these powerful but also slippery definitions of what men and women are, and it is from this incomplete mix that the book draws its rhetorical power. Ours is only a little power, seems like, next to theirs, Moss said, but it goes down deep, it's all roots, it's like an old blackberry thicket, and a wizard's power like a fir tree. Maybe, great and tall and grand, but it'll blow right down in a storm. Nothing kills a blackberry bramble. The best I can say, it's like this. A man's in his skin, see, like a nut in its shell. It's hard and strong, that shell, and it's full of him. Full of grand man meat, man self, and that's all there is. A woman's a different thing entirely. Who knows where a woman begins and ends? Listen, mistress, I have roots deeper than this island, deeper than the sea, older than the raising of the lands. I go back into the dark, before the moon I am what a woman is. A woman of power, a woman's power, deeper than the roots of trees, deeper than the roots of islands, older than the making, older than the moon. Who dares ask questions of the dark? Who will ask the dark its name? Well, there is a character that asks the dark its name, isn't there? These pieces of the puzzle given by Ged, by Moss, by Tanar, are all only semi-correct. They don't fit into each other perfectly, they don't hold the perfect truth, but that's because the perfect truth is impossible to find. All we can do is wrestle with these pieces we have. But Earthsea has always been like this. The magic that the magicians wield is hard to nail down. Tehanu also has one of the most important elements in all of the stories. Ged, who used to be Archmage, sleeps with a woman. The vow of celibacy made by the wizards of Roke, or more accurately the vow of division between wizards and witches, between men and women, between scholars and mothers, is broken. It was very interesting to write, not an easy one. The way I handled it upset many of my older readers, particularly men, because they saw it as a feminist statement and were alarmed. They perceived it as a kind of betrayal because my hero Ged had lost his power, and a male hero who had lost his power was degraded in some people's eyes. It was a radical revision from within of my whole enterprise in writing, and for a while I wondered if it was going to silence me. But I think if I hadn't gone through with it, and learned how to write from my own being as a woman, I probably would have stopped writing. Alright, we're almost done, but I have one more story to share with you. Of the 9 masters on Roke Island, one is called the Master Namer. He sits alone in the isolate tower, simply writing names in ink that will disappear by nightfall. I think many people have conceptualized this, as they should, as a metafictional symbol. The magic itself is a kind of metafiction. If you know the true name of something, you have power. And if you use that name, you can use that power to change the world around you, or to change yourself. In that vein, many people see writers as namers, in a way. If you ask me, I think that Rothfuss pays homage to Ursula by having his main character try out naming at the beginning of his novel, only for him to foolishly throw himself off a building to terrible result. In a way, it's Rothfuss confessing that he can't do what Ursula does, but does Ursula see herself as a namer? There are 2 more books in the Earthsea cycle, a collection of short stories called Tales of Earthsea, and the real final novel, The Other Wind. The latter is actually my favorite piece of fantasy literature ever, and I would love to talk about it, but I think instead I will leave it for you to discover. It's better that way. But what I will discuss is one of the short stories in Tales from Earthsea, a short story that bridges the gap between Tehanu and The Other Wind, a story called Dragonfly. Dragonfly is the name of a girl who has no mother. Her father, too, is negligent and hard, and refuses her a true name on her naming day. With that, she is only left with Dragonfly. Just Dragonfly. Even when she forces the village witch to give her a name, the name she's given is Iria, the same name as her father's homeland. Years later, she has grown into a tall and strong young woman who lives alone. A court wizard tries to entice her by telling her stories, but she is more interested in Roke than him, an island that teaches magic, an island where she could learn true names. After a strange relationship, she convinces the wizard to take her, a girl, to the island of scholarly men. At the island, the mage tries to get Iria to tell him her true name, saying she needs it to get into school, and to his surprise, she tells him. Unafraid, this breaks him down, and he finally asks her in frustration and confusion, "What are you?" To this she says that is what she is en route to find out. Eventually, she makes it to the doorkeeper, who is one of the 9 masters. He asks for her true name, which she again says, but the doorkeeper is a wise man, and something seems strange about this woman. He tells her that is only part of her name, and that there is more. But then, he lets her in. He lets a woman into the school for men for the first time in centuries. The other masters are inside, and they are almost all aghast at what the doormaster has done. It is not right, not proper to have women en route. To this, the doormaster replies, "Who are we that we refuse her without knowing what she is?" The masters convene to decide her fate, but there is another master who is not quite so difficult to convince, and who might be on her side. The master patterner, a red-faced, pale-haired man from the Kargad lands, the lands that believe in the old gods. He accepts Irian into his domain, an immense garden called the Imminent Grove, that expands on the inside to an impossibly large forest. He takes care of Irian there, and teaches her about the grove, about how it whispers, about what it says. After weeks of her sitting, learning in the Imminent Grove, he sits down with her in the grass of the forest, and starts to tell her the history of it all. He talks about Ged, about Roke Island, he talks about the other masters, about women and men, about himself. He tells her his old name, the one he had before he became the namer, Asver. "I should go," she said. "I can walk in the grove, but not live there. It isn't my place. And the master chanter said I did harm by being here." "We all do harm by being," said the patterner. He did as he often did, made a little design out of whatever lay to hand. On the bit of sand on the river bank in front of him, he set a leaf stem, a grass blade, and several petals. He studied them and rearranged them. As he discusses the crisis the school faced after the disappearance of Ged, he relates to Iria the trial of deciding where to find a new archmage. "But we met, we sat, but we could not choose. We said this and said that, but no name was spoken. And then he paused a while. There came on me what my people call the Edvarvanu, the other breath. Words came to me and I spoke them. I said, Hama Gondun, and Kudum Karmuruk told them this in Hardback. A woman on Gond. But when I came back to my own wits, I could not tell what that meant. And so we parted with no archmage chosen. The patterner pushed 4 pebbles into a little curve in the sand and said, I wish the sparrowhawk had not gone. I wish I could read what the shadows write, but all I can hear the leaves say is change. Change. Everything will change, but them. He looked up into the trees again with that yearning look. The sun was setting. He stood up, bade her good night gently, and walked away, entering under the trees. Ursula, more than likely, has a little piece of her in all of her characters. Phillips acknowledges that much of herself was poured into the male and female characters of Earthsea. She was Ged, Tanar, Tehanu, Arin. But at this moment of the story, when the young girl is given a chance to listen to what the leaves whisper, I truly feel like I know who Ursula thought she was. And I love sitting with Iria and hearing what the old patterner with pale hair has to say before she leaves. Dragonfly exits the imminent grove and is immediately accosted by the Master Summoner, the most powerful of the 9. He knows that this is no place for women, that Roke is a place he returned to take his own, to become Archmage in Ged's stead. He stands on the place where things exist as they are, the Roke Knoll. But as he approaches Irian, he calls out her true name to control her, but it doesn't work. And in a stand of giant defiance, she says, I am not only Irian. The summer lunges at her, but before he can touch her, there is a flash. She towered above him impossibly, fire breaking forth between them, a flare of red flame in the dusk air, a gleam of red gold scales, of vast wings. Then that was gone, and there was nothing there but the woman standing on the hill path, and the tall man bowing down before her, bowing slowly down to earth, and lying on it. And that ends the story of the girl who had changed Roke, the girl that the patterner foresaw. A girl who was at once 2 things, dragon and woman. A girl with 2 names. Dragonfly. In a way, Roke has changed. Literature has changed. The fantasy genre has changed. But they must also continue to do so. And while I think it is clear that Ursula thought she was a little too slow on the draw to be the perfect change people wanted, the way she changed how we pattern our words, how we shape the worlds of the impossible, of the fantastic, of our imagination, cannot be understated. It was exactly what we needed. Ursula K. Le Guin left through those trees on January 22nd, 2018. Charles Le Guin, her husband and an incredible supporter of her role as both a writer and a mother, died just over a month ago on January 4th, 2025. And perhaps he met her on the other side of that wall of stones.